When Emperor Nero's Rome trembled under revolt and uncertainty, no one imagined that an elderly, stiff-backed general named Servius Sulpicius Galba would soon be thrust into the most dangerous throne in the world. Galba had not sought the purple. At 70, he was a survivor from the era of Augustus, a man shaped by long marches, harsh camps, and the rigid discipline of old republican virtues. Yet the tides of fate and the desperation of Rome's legions would drag him into the violent theater of imperial collapse. The empire in 68 AD simmered with rebellion. Governors in Gaul had turned against Nero. Soldiers muttered angrily about neglected pay, and Rome's senators whispered in corners, fearing both the emperor's paranoia and their own uncertain futures. Amid this chaos, Galba, then governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, had maintained a dignified neutrality. But when Julius Vindex raised a revolt in Gaul and called upon Galba to restore liberty, the old general hesitated. He was no revolutionary. He valued order, not glory. Only when messengers arrived with news that Nero had declared him an enemy of the state did Galba finally raise the banner of rebellion, and even then, reluctantly. His troops proclaimed him legatus senatus populique Romani, a representative of the Senate and people of Rome, reviving a title not used since the civil wars a century earlier. It was a symbolic declaration. Galba was not an ambitious usurper, but a restorer of the old Roman dignity, or so he wished the world to believe. But Rome's political currents were faster and deadlier than Galba understood. Even as he marched toward Italy, Nero's authority crumbled from within. The Praetorian Guard, bribed by the scheming prefect Nymphidius Sabinus, abandoned Nero and declared loyalty to Galba, hoping the old man would be easy to manipulate. When Nero learned of the betrayal, he fled, panicked, and ultimately ended his life. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome for nearly a century, was finished. Galba had not even reached Rome when the news arrived. He was now emperor. Yet triumph did not soften him. On his march through Italy, he confronted disorder with the sharp, cold discipline for which he was known. He executed officers loyal to Nero, punished towns that had wavered in their allegiance, and refused to pay the donative, the promised cash reward that the Praetorians believed they were owed for supporting him. To Galba, the emperor must be obeyed, not bought. But Rome no longer lived in the austere world of Augustus. The soldiers, senators, and common people expected generosity, spectacle, and reward. Galba's refusal to play by these new rules planted the earliest seeds of his downfall even before he stepped inside the city. As he entered Rome in October of 68 AD, the crowds offered polite applause, but no real enthusiasm. The Praetorians watched him with narrowed eyes. Senators whispered that he was too old, too severe, too rigid. The year of the 4 emperors had begun, and Galba stood unknowingly at the edge of a storm. Galba's first days in Rome revealed the vast gulf between his vision of imperial rule and the reality he faced. He imagined himself as a restorer of discipline and moral integrity, an emperor who would cleanse the corruption of Nero's decadent court. But his methods were harsh, and his judgment often clouded by the belief that the empire could still be governed like a disciplined military camp. He immediately replaced Nero's officials, but he did not stop there. Entire groups of administrators were prosecuted, executed, or stripped of wealth. Many deserved it. Others were victims of rumor or political convenience. Galba famously said, "It is my custom to choose soldiers, not buy them." But his principles quickly isolated him from the Praetorians, whose support was essential for survival. The people of Rome, who had tolerated Nero's excesses because he entertained them lavishly, found Galba's austerity suffocating.
He canceled festivals, restricted public spending, and ended the extravagant games that Nero had once used to charm the masses. To Galba, these were necessary corrections. To the people, they felt like punishment. Perhaps his greatest weakness was the reliance on three close advisors, Venus, Laco, and Icolus, known mockingly as the Three Pedagogues. These men wielded enormous influence and were widely seen as corrupt. Though Galba himself was austere, his advisors demanded bribes, sold positions, and manipulated imperial decisions. Rome soon whispered that Galba had traded Nero's tyranny for the tyranny of opportunists. As tensions mounted, the legions in Germany revolted. They had already felt slighted when Galba refused to confirm their chosen commander, Aulus Vitellius, and when he denied them the customary reward for swearing loyalty to a new emperor. Feeling insulted and ignored, they responded by proclaiming Vitellius emperor. Suddenly, Galba faced a crisis. Rome had two emperors. His advisors panicked. Some urged negotiation, others demanded swift military action. But Galba was slow to act, weighed down by age and indecision. In desperation, he adopted a young nobleman, Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus, as his successor, hoping this act of stability would secure loyalty. But the Praetorian Guard had its own candidate, Marcus Salvius Otho, a former friend of Nero, and the man who believed the throne had been promised to him. When Galba announced Piso instead, the city buzzed with rumors, anger, and treachery. Otho, humiliated and ambitious, secretly bribed key members of the Praetorian Guard. The same soldiers Galba had insulted by refusing their donative began to shift their allegiance. Galba did not see the danger. He believed his moral authority would shield him, but Rome was no longer moved by virtue. Power belonged to whoever could command loyalty or buy it. The capital trembled with uncertainty. In taverns, soldiers whispered Otho's name. In the Senate, men already wondered whether Galba's reign would soon end. And in the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, a plan was forming, one that would end in blood on the stones of the Roman Forum. January of 69 AD dawned cold and tense. The Praetorian Guard had already been bought by Otho's gold and promises, but Galba remained unaware, or unwilling to believe, that his own protectors were sharpening their swords against him. On the morning of January 15, Galba prepared to present himself to the Senate. His advisors urged him to remain inside the palace. Rumors of mutiny were spreading. But Galba, stubborn and certain that discipline could still control the situation, insisted on going out. "Let everyone see that I am emperor," he said. Meanwhile, the Praetorian conspirators gathered in their barracks. Otho arrived quietly, dressed in ordinary clothes, pretending to pray at a nearby temple. The guard officers greeted him with the salute reserved for emperors. Within minutes, hundreds of soldiers armed themselves and marched toward the Forum. Word reached Galba as he was being carried through the streets in his litter. Panic rippled through his escort. Civilians scattered. Some shouted warnings, others simply hid. Galba's small retinue urged him to retreat to the palace, but he shook his head. "If it is for the good of the Roman people, I am ready to die," he declared. But noble words had little power in the year of the 4 emperors. As Galba approached the Forum, the rebel soldiers surrounded him. Dust rose from their boots, sunlight glinting off their spears. His men tried to flee. A few remained and died where they stood. The litter toppled as the soldiers slashed its supports, throwing the old emperor to the ground. Galba attempted to rise. His armor was ceremonial, not functional, and it slid awkwardly as he struggled to stand. "What do you want, my friends? I am your emperor," he tried to say, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of blades, shields, and shouting soldiers. One soldier, identified in some accounts as a man named Camurius, stepped forward and struck the fatal blow. Others joined, stabbing and hacking until the old general lay lifeless on the stones he had once hoped to purify. His severed head was raised on a spear and carried through the streets as Otho's supporters proclaimed the new emperor. Piso, Galba's chosen heir, attempted to hide in the Temple of Vesta, but was dragged out and murdered shortly after. The Senate, terrified and cornered, immediately declared Otho the rightful emperor. Roman politics now belonged to the strongest sword. Galba's reign had lasted only 7 months. As his headless body lay abandoned, Rome shifted once again to a new ruler, one whose own fate would soon be consumed by the unending chaos of 69 AD. The year of the 4 emperors was far from over.
Galba's death marked not only the end of a brief and troubled reign, but also the collapse of Rome's last illusion that the empire could still be governed by the moral values of an older age. His rule was a collision between ancient republican discipline and the brutal political realities of the imperial world. In hindsight, historians have judged Galba both harshly and sympathetically. He was honest but inflexible, principled but incapable of understanding the society he ruled. Rome in 69 AD demanded spectacle, generosity, and political finesse. Galba offered none of these. Instead, he tried to impose order through fear, expecting his authority as emperor to command loyalty. But authority, unbalanced by generosity or charisma, quickly turned to isolation. His attempts at reform, purging corrupt officials, restoring discipline in the army, and attempting to cut waste from the state budget might have worked in more stable times, but the empire was already fractured by years of Nero's mismanagement, and Galba had neither the time nor the popular support needed to repair it. The army, once Rome's great stabilizing force, had become a political weapon. Legions now made emperors and unmade them. Galba misread this new reality, believing a stern commander could still impose discipline. Instead, the soldiers saw him as a relic of a bygone age, an emperor who demanded obedience but offered nothing in return. Galba's greatest mistake was trusting the wrong men. Vinius, Laco, and Aesebus manipulated imperial power for personal gain, turning public opinion sharply against him. The people who might have admired his virtues instead saw a distant, inflexible ruler controlled by greedy advisors. Whether Galba understood their corruption or was simply too old and weary to challenge it remains a mystery. In death, Galba became a symbol of the year's spiraling chaos. His murder set a precedent. Emperors could now fall in weeks, even days, not years. Otho replaced him, then Vitellius replaced Otho, then Vespasian rose to end the cycle. The empire had become a battlefield of ambition, a place where legitimacy mattered less than the loyalty of whichever army stood closest to Rome. And yet, despite his failures, Galba's legacy is not entirely tragic. He was, in many ways, the last Roman leader shaped purely by the ideals of the early empire, the ideals of duty, austerity, and service. He believed deeply in restoring order, and he entered the throne not for glory, but because he believed Rome needed him. His downfall came not from evil intentions, but from the brutal truth that ideals cannot survive without the political skill needed to enforce them. Galba died as he lived, a soldier of the old world, crushed by the new.